welcome. I'm Jean Parker, and you're listening to Discovering How, a podcast of the Ethical Business Building the Future organization. We're a global learning community using our workplaces to build a better future. Today we're discovering more about design processes for enacting social and organizational transformation. Stephanie Akkaoui-Hughes utilizes her work as an architect to promote a variety of ongoing adaptable human interactions. But first, Jelena Hercberga is a Ph.D. researcher at the University of Bristol in the UK. Her work focuses on perception of difference, contributing to a larger question of how society can organize itself to embrace ongoing encounters with difference. She says an organization or individual doesn't gain self-knowledge only through self-introspection. Rather, our greatest self-knowledge comes from deliberately interacting with those who are different than we are in some way. She also believes that goals like justice and diversity must be redefined as we progress, and their achievement is never fully completed.
An individual or an organization can better understand their purpose by engaging, by being in ongoing dialogue with the other, the different, by exposing yourself to the other, and by being in a dialogue with this difference, you inevitably renegotiate your own identity, and you inevitably go back to yourself, and you understand better yourself with every new encounter with difference.
What do you observe when you look at people interacting?
People are afraid of ambiguity, complexity, and something that is unknown. And they pretty much afraid of stepping outside of their comfort zone. And therefore, probably we have this tendency to return home, meaning to create something that would be peaceful, just, white and fluffy. However, life, if you think about it, life, it's absolutely not like this. Life is great because it has all the different sides. You can learn so much by exposing yourself to this unknown. It can be quite exciting.
In EBBF and in a lot of groups that are concerned with ethics and values in business, we talk a lot about business contributing to the common good. So how does that relate to this idea of the politics of the common good?
Because what is common good? What is good for one could be bad for another person. And what is good for one part of society will not necessarily be as good for another part of society. So contributing for me means being part of this ongoing conversation involving various different social stakeholders, and contributing by your opinion to this conversation, but also listening to others, because it is not about defining, which I think a lot of conversations are obsessed about. It's about pinning down what is our common good, and then developing a plan to help us achieve this common good. On the contrary, I think it should be an ongoing conversation about and negotiations about understanding
what the common good is, really?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that your perception of common good might be different than my perception of common good? And so if we don't get that straightened out, we can't really contribute to the common good in the best way.
Absolutely. And what more, I think, is that my understanding of what is common good or what is good, and your understanding of what is good will be different maybe in 2 months from now, in 2 years, because we will be different. It's about allowing yourself to understand, you look at it from your point of view, but your point of view does not mean the truth or the only point of view. And I guess it's about understanding that there are many, many, many different points of view, and actually together they might start moving you closer to what is right. Following this thinking, you could say that the whole process could be a discomfort with yourself, and kind of finding ways of having this discomfort or having this internal conflict that can be constructive.
Stephanie Akkaoui-Hughes is an architect in Amsterdam. She practices architecture in a way that promotes social transformation by deliberately creating incompleteness, impermanence, and imperfection to invite collaborative participation of people. The design process she uses can be adapted to create anything transformative. What is it about the way you grew up that helped you conceptualize these ideas?
I grew up in Lebanon, in Beirut, during the war years. So there was a lot, it was an unusual way to grow up in a sense. I think the most interesting part of that for me was the way people appropriated space, private spaces, public spaces, spaces in between. We had a civil war, and the city was literally divided in two areas, in two halves. Then there is the crossing of the zone in the middle, but then there is also this notion of what's public, what's private. So for a long time there was actually no government. So that also means that public space is up for grabs in a sense. So you see a lot of dynamics happening in the public space that are privatized by people simply as things as small as putting a chair on the sidewalk. And that changes the whole dynamic of the street. And I was able to actually observe a lot of that as a child. And I think it's only until years later that I can rationalize it. But I think I was always fascinated by this notion of people and space and all of the different variations that come. So it really comes down to the equation of people and space. It was really created as a process to take any thought or idea or issue from an issue into creating a vision for that issue, and then implementing that vision, and then being able to adapt and kind of optimize that solution or that idea for times to come when things change.
And what are the attributes of that process?
This process is a collaborative process in the sense that we need the active participation of a number of different parties. That includes us as architects or designers, but also other expertises, other disciplines, as well as, most importantly, the end users themselves. And when this process is applied to a non-architectural and not even a design industry, for example, a manager in an office can use this process to understand the issues of his team and come up with a vision on how this can be different, and then go into the implementation of that. The idea is that then for him, he needs absolutely the participation of his team. So that's one of the main attributes of that process. The other two attributes that are kind of that make the top three is that the fact that this process starts before any design component per se. The first phase of that process is really to talk about understanding the issue and understanding the problems and the questions behind the questions. And then the last phase of the process constitutes the third attribute, and this is where it's a completely adapting phase that only happens after, in our case, we would say the space or the building is done and it's being used, and then we go into a last phase, so we don't stop there. And that adapting attribute is very important to create a resilient situation or a resilient system. The last phase of the process, once we're going through this adapting, actually creates a renewed understanding in our minds, but also in the minds of the user. So it actually goes back to the first phase of the process in a sense. So it is definitely an iterative, cyclical process. And our belief behind that is that actually nothing is permanent or static. Even when it is, it can only be so for a very short, limited amount of time, and then things change. And for us, when we talk about space specifically, a space is made by definition to be static. A building is made to be permanent and rigid and solid in a sense. And the paradox in that is that space also needs to be able to adapt and support people as things change almost every day.
You mentioned before about impermanence. What does that have to do with it?
When we go through this process, we have three qualities in mind: impermanence, imperfection, and incompleteness. And the idea is not to be obsessed with making things complete, permanent, and perfect, but instead accepting the fact that things need to be incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. So I'll give you an example. When we talk about the incompleteness, it's this idea that when we create something as the so-called experts, being the architects, if we create something incomplete, that gap, that part that is not completed by us, is actually the invitation to the users to give their input. So we create gaps and open spaces in things, not literally, sometimes not, sometimes in the design, sometimes in the ideas. But the point is that if we give everything that is complete, you're not inviting people to close the gap, in a sense. So imagine a circle that has a piece of it missing. The eye automatically longs to close that gap. So we see it as a circle. We don't see it as an arc. So that's really the first quality. The second one, the quality of impermanence, is to simply accept the reality that things are not permanent and things move and things change. And there's actually that's not a challenge or a kind of disadvantage. That's actually an opportunity to use that impermanence to collect the insights of users and of other experts and incorporate that into the design. So the process in itself is very impermanent, and we embrace that impermanence because there's value there. That even though we have made a decision regarding design, let's say, at some point in the process, that decision can be is not looked at as a permanent final thing and can at any moment be upgraded and reconsidered for the good of the project, in a sense. The challenge there is, of course, as human beings, we're not trained to embrace uncertainty and impermanence.
Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive, isn't it? There's a lot of people, no, we want things not to change.
Exactly, absolutely. I mean, we tell clients that we're going to design a space that is incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect for them, and I'm surprised they still hire us.
So talk about this idea of incomplete.
Yeah, it's really, we also say that even when things are finished and you move into this new building, you will find it incomplete, and that's a good thing, because that still gives us room to adapt based on use. Because up to that moment in the process, we've been talking with people and observing them. However, language has its limitation, communication has its limitations, and even observing people in a different environment will give you different insights. So once they actually move into the final building or the new space for them, and we observe them in that environment, there are new insights that come out. And it's very good that there is still room to incorporate those, because if we had made things very rigid up to that point and delivered a final, complete, finished, permanent product, which is a space in our case, then there's no room for adapting after that, and then it's considered a mistake, or there's no budget left for it, or there's no time. And for us, we look at all of this as an incorporated thing, and this is where the last phase comes in. So often I get the question, well, this last phase isn't going to delay everything, so it's longer and more expensive because you keep working after people move in. And I say, that's not the case. We don't keep working after people move in. People move in before we finish working. And it's really this idea that this has to be, it has to be an incorporated part of the process. It's not an add-on. The whole process is not, the whole quality of the process drops if that phase is not done. And the last quality is that of imperfection. And this is normally the one that people struggle the most with. And with imperfection, we talk about the human aesthetics. So we're in this era where everything has to be perfect and, you know, sharp edges and shiny materials, and it's this kind of almost sterile design. If you look at any design magazine, it's very, very common to see no people at all in the spaces. And if you see some human beings, they're always actually young, beautiful, perfect, and nothing is out of place. That's not the reality of things. And that's also not what we can expect of people when they start using the spaces we've created for them. So for us, we need to embrace that humanity, but also the humanity of even non-human things, like a path in a forest, the tree trunk that's never straight. You know, I may sound poetic, but these things make the space really support people's interactions and not impose on them living in a sterile, straight, perfect box.
You've mentioned before about architecting interaction. Tell me what that means.
Well, very simply, it's really for us using architecture as a way to support and foster interactions. We ran a masterclass training for individuals. So there are people that came to us from around the world, fresh graduates, young professionals, mid-level professionals. And what we did with them for a week is guide them through this process with basically 3 goals. The 3 goals of that training were, first, to help them figure out what their vision is. And that is the 2 first phases of the process. The first one being understanding themselves and understanding the world around them. And the second one being actually being able to formulate what their vision for the world is. So in other words, what are the things that they need to do and the actions that they need to take to make sure that this vision becomes reality? And of course, it's a long-term thing. Then we also help them to, first of all, accept the fact that the plan will not go according to plan. And then we kind of equipped them with tips and tools and ways of thinking and concrete kind of going around actions to be able to say, when the plan doesn't go according to plan, here are things I can do to do something else. So if I try something and it doesn't work, then I can do something else. And this is really the adapting phase. So we use this process on an individual level to help an individual person figure out what they want for themselves or for the world or both, and how to make it happen. It's, you know, things do change, and that's a good thing. And then we need to be able to just adapt to it and be resilient to it, or just incorporate it. And that is really the first challenge of all of this, is the mentality.
Thank you for joining us. We hope today's program has inspired you, our listeners, with ideas for discovering how we can all build a prosperous, just, and sustainable civilization. This has been Ethical Business Building the Future, Discovering How. Get more from this podcast by sharing your comments, an article, or a link to something that's important to you. You can contact us on our website, www.ebbf.org. I'm Jean Parker for EBBF, and I thank you for listening.